Welcome back to our reading through the Bible in a year. And as we take you through this, we've come to Exodus 13 through Exodus 28. And again, as I'm walking you through and preparing you for your reading for the week, here's what I want you to be looking for. The year now is around 1445 BC. And the people are about to exodus Egypt. They are about, that's what the word means, to leave, exit, both slavery and Egypt. And they come to this great miracle of the dividing of the Red Sea. Now, some critics, as you read this, because it's quite a remarkable thing, God divides a sea so that on dry land the people can escape the oncoming onslaught of the Egyptian army. So some critics want to say that it was really the Reed Sea, which is located further north, and it's only a few feet of water deep. And they say that's really what happened. The people crossed over 3 feet of water. The only problem with that is that would mean that the whole Egyptian army then drowned in 3 feet of water, and that would be even a greater miracle. Sometimes we just need to read the scriptures and trust the truth. Well, this is such a big deal that Moses writes a song, and everybody's going to sing this song. And so that one chapter, it's all this one song of celebration. Might give you some ideas of how you can express your gratefulness for God delivering you from time to time. Well, now they're out of Egypt, and where do they find themselves? In the desert. But watch how God can provide water and food for them. As a matter of fact, you're going to be introduced to this word manna. And manna simply means in Hebrew, what is it? And we're not too sure, but it seemed to be some kind of crusty wafer produced by the dew on the ground. And so during their time in the desert, because they're heading towards Mount Sinai, this is before we get to the 40-year wanderings. That's not until the book of Numbers. So they're grumbling, but they haven't rebelled yet. And so what you're going to see is that God, while they're heading now from Egypt past the Red Sea onto Mount Sinai, God's going to provide water, manna, and even meat for their time there in the desert. But the people will continually grumble over these provisions. So Moses now, he's trying to lead this multitude of people by himself, and he's getting a real big headache. So his father-in-law, Jethro, gives him counsel to split the responsibilities up and share the burden. So finally, they all show up, this multitude of people. Now, by the way, it could be 2 million people. Dr. Ron Allen, who's a Hebrew professor, shows that in the Hebrew language, in their grammar, if they wanted to communicate as something being huge, they would basically multiply the number by 10. Because in 1445 BC, at this time, we have in secular history about these huge armies of 100,000, 200,000. Well, if you had a group of 2 million people moving around in the desert, that seems to be historically a little bit off. And so it is felt that possibly we're talking about 200,000 people, but this was such a huge group of people that the Hebrew grammar would have them multiplied by 10 and thus make it not 200,000, but 2 million. But either way, we'll talk to Moses when we get up there. Well, they come to Mount Sinai to receive guidance because at this point, they're not sure. They know God's powerful, God's got a miracle, God delivers them, but that's about all they know. And so God's going to share with them, they're going to receive guidance from the Decalogue, means the 10 Commandments, and it's going to be given to Moses. And the people now will know exactly what God expects from his people. So if they want to honor him, please him, they'll know exactly how to do that. And as you will read through later the 10 Commandments, you're going to find the first 4 have to do with loving God. And the last 6 have to do with loving each other. And remember when Matthew 22, when that lawyer came to Jesus and said, what's the most important thing God ever said? Remember Jesus said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, spirit. But then Jesus said, but that's not where it ends. He says, for the second is as the first, love your neighbor as yourself. And at that point, he says, upon these 2 commandments, all the law, all the prophets, the whole scriptures rely upon. And remember what that means? It's easy to say, I want to love God. But how do you love God? If God leaves it up to us, we're going to have all kinds of religions. People are going to cut people's heads off saying they're doing it because they're pleasing God by an Arabic word. The point is that God tells us how he is to be loved. And he says, you love me by loving your neighbor as yourself. And when you love your neighbor, that's when you're loving me. That's why when Paul's asked in Galatians 5:14, you want to keep the law of Christ? You say, sure. He says, then love your neighbor as yourself. James does the same thing in James chapter 2, verse 8. He says, you want to keep the royal law of God? Yeah. He says, love your neighbor as yourself, because it's loving your neighbor is the way we love God, and there's no other way to love God. And that's why in these 10 commandments, you notice the first 4 is how we love God. The last 6 is how we love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, the implications of these laws in everyday life are now broken down into what's called ordinances. And these ordinances are going to be summarized. Now, this is going to be slow reading for some of you, but stick to it, because it's going to have to do with the ordinances, the laws of personal injuries, property rights, social interactions, finances. So now you have, after they are prepared, they know what God wants them to do, to love him and love others and how to love others. People are now prepared to travel. And so they're ready to enter into that promised land that's been given to them to conquer. So now they're going to have to head back north. But something horrible happens, and we're going to see that, especially when we begin the book of Numbers. But before they're ready to leave, they affirm their covenant to honor and obey God. And so as a sign of that, God wanted to have a place that would remind them of his presence. So he creates a place called the Tabernacle. It's to house the holy things of God. And so in the Tabernacle, which was this very carefully designed tent with the outside of black goat furs, and there you're going to have the ark, the showbread, the lampstands, the curtains, the veil, bronze altar, the court, the garments of the priest. All of this is so that the people will be able to focus while they're in the desert, because this tabernacle tent could be moved around as they travel, but will always remind them of their focus of worship on the God who delivered them as such. But with all of this, they're going to continue to grumble and grumble. And next week, we'll pick it up where their grumbling takes them. Again, remember, study to show thyself a workman who need not be ashamed of himself, rightly dividing the word of truth. We'll see you next week.